itself. This is why things like traditionalism could exist and exist efficiently for millennia as the dominant and most efficient mode of gene replication for our species, and can then, after some watershed technological advance comes on the scene, it can then collapse so rapidly and dramatically within a period of a few decades due to it being rendered obsolete by this new technology. And so we need to talk a bit more in depth about this, because I know I've mentioned this before, but let's try to put it in perspective a bit better here. We often hear this talking point that if traditionalism is so bad, why did it exist for millennia? And then they go on to say, well, traditionalism's values are still relevant, etc., etc. And yes, traditionalism did exist for millennia. Absolutely it did. And horseback cavalry warfare and archery existed for thousands of years. And then we invented tanks and rifles, and people naturally rejected horseback warfare in short order. A period of decades, and those that stubbornly refused to do so were gunned down by machine gun fire and tank turret shells. And likewise, those that stubbornly stick to traditionalism will eventually meet the metaphorical Abrams tanks and the repeater rifles when they clash headfirst with a rapidly changing organic reformation of male and female gender roles and expectations. And I think when dealing with this problem, this constant meme that is propagated by these types, I think what it is that perhaps some people just don't truly understand how much of a watershed moment the Industrial Revolution was, for example. So hopefully this will provide to you some context. Wikipedia gives the first record of the domestication of the horse, and historians argue over this. There's actually quite a bit of contention between what exactly domestication is defined as, and by virtue of that, there's a significant time range of dispute. But I'll just go with the, quote, earliest, latest dates given as a time range for the domestication of the horse. The earlier time range given by Wikipedia being about 4000 BCE and the later entry being about 2000 BCE. So we're going to go with this 2000 figure. And by the way, if you have any evidence to contradict this, feel free to post it in the comment section. So let's take this 2000 BCE figure all the way up to the Industrial Revolution. Now that's almost 4,000 years of Genghis Khan on his steep and Attila sacking Rome on horseback and Rome in their chariots and the Egyptians in their chariots, and the list goes on and on and on, all the way up to the horse and buggies of the 1800s, in which all peoples in this time period, all of them, whether they lived 200 years apart or 2,000 years apart, knew this animal, the domesticated horse, as the primary and most efficient method of transportation our species could devise. And then comes the Industrial Revolution. Now, Wikipedia cites the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution as starting out in about the 1780s and not fully being felt until about the 1840s. So we'll meet it halfway in the middle and say it started in 1810. Now, from that period, it took us only until 1903 for the Wright brothers to first achieve flight, and then 38 years go by, that's 4 short decades, and the technology of flight is now weaponized and used to bomb Pearl Harbor. And 28 years later, just 3 short decades later, we propelled our Apollo 11 rocket engines to escape velocity and landed on the moon 4 days later. During that same time period, the first Model T rolled off the line circa, 1908? And if we fast forward to present day, we now have 12-cylinder Lamborghinis and Ferraris and Porsches, and for the first time ever, Google has constructed a robotic vehicle that is a superior driver in many respects to the human beings that created them. Let that sink in for a moment. We went 4,000 years where our most advanced form of transportation was the horse. And then in a period of about 200 years, we've managed to invent these new forms of transportation and use them to visit our first alien world. We've managed to send probes to every planet in our solar system. We've created the Voyager Golden Record. That is the first declaration to the universe and to other possible sentient species out there, if they exist, that we exist. That we are human beings and we exist. Now, to some people, that may not be important, but to me, it's one of the most profound achievements of our species, and it makes me proud to be a human being. And I know I'm going on a bit of a tangent here again, but in honor of our achievement, in honor of humanity's achievement, I want to share from the Voyager Golden Record that we've blasted off into space. I want to share 3 images that I consider to be the most important images in human history. Not only because this is what an alien species encountering our little beacon that we've blasted off into space would first see when opening it, but because it displays what I believe to be the most important human bonds and interactions, that is the creation of the male human being and the transmission of knowledge from father to son, the most hated natural bond of feminists and the most feared natural bond of traitorous, divorce-prone women that can't suppress their hypergamy long enough to allow it to form. And I'm sure you're not used to this, a man telling other men to be proud to be men without worshiping at the altar of women for double the time as a disclaimer. Well, it's time you get used to it, because I'm going to do what no MRA or egalitarian or equalist or whatever will. I'm going to make you proud to be a man again. But anyway, it should be noted that in this short span of time, the human species has experienced such rapid growth that it was bound to change humanity in a myriad of unforeseen ways. So then, going back to the claim that traditionalism existed for thousands of years and holding this up as some kind of model of human relations between men and women based solely on its longevity preceding the Industrial Revolution displays an unfortunate trend of human nature in and of itself. That is, the tendency for our species to not realize when it's in the middle of undergoing watershed and historical change. Now, most people living in periods of mass human change aren't cognizant of the change when it's happening. It takes some historian 100 or 200 or 300 years later to really spell it out, after everybody who lived in that era is dead and gone, unfortunately. Most people will opt instead for a stubborn adherence to traditions that give them unconscious security instead of first conceptualizing and then seizing the opportunity. The extremely rare opportunity, mind you, of voluntarily charging into their era's brave new world. So the assertion of traditionalism's effectiveness based solely on its longevity is a malformed assertion in which a key point is ignored. That key point is that in the last 200 years or so, the human species has experienced a degree of technological change that has rendered a plethora of previously functional human traditions obsolete, and in order to discern whether or not traditionalism is in fact a victim of this great obsolescence, one must ask instead, how has traditionalism as a cultural mechanism for building families fared since the Industrial Revolution? We need to gauge the effectiveness of cultural norms within the context of our brave new world now, not within the context of what existed before it. And this is going to be the main story of the human saga for centuries to come. Our future is going to be for hundreds and possibly even thousands of years into the future. A tale of which groups of human beings will be able to adjust to massive changes to the way our instincts manifest themselves due to the exponential increase in technological development that was the last century in particular. So with all that said, I want to now talk about a certain, in my opinion, flawed axiom I hear from time to time. And it goes something like this, and it's usually uttered by traditionalists. What I'm talking about is when you hear the argument made that men going their own way are inherently unsustainable, and that the future belongs to those who reproduce, and that populations adhering to traditional methods of familial propagation will inherit the earth in one way or another. And I've even heard some saying that, Mormons and Muslims are destined to be the most successful people in the future solely by virtue of their superior birth rates alone. Well, that's an interesting claim. Let's ask ourselves, why do we live in a world where the vast majority of wealth on this planet is concentrated in 1% of the world's population? Here's a graph of fertility rates versus per capita GDP on a Wikipedia entry titled The Demographic Economic Paradox, which is stated as the inverse correlation found between wealth and fertility within and between nations. And it says that the higher the degree of education and GDP per capita of a human population, subpopulation, or social stratum, the fewer children are born in any industrialized Western country, or any industrialized country for that matter. You see, I suspect that this the fertile will inherit the earth axiom is a completely false proposition. Those that will rule the earth in the coming decades and centuries to come are those that know how to breed efficiently. Quality over quantity is the name of the game here. After all, if, God or evolution or whatever being or force that put us here meant for us to simply replicate our genes forever and ever without something more, we'd still be amoebas and bacteria. And you see, the future of the human race will be decided by those that are willing to get in front of what we're headed towards. That is, the streamlining of the human reproductive process. These folks, whoever they end up being, will at best wield economic supremacy over the useless breeders, and at worst, enslave them altogether. And what am I talking about when I say that those that are willing to get ahead of the streamlining of the human reproductive process? What do I mean when I say that? Well, I'll show you this infographic, and the link to this is in the description box, that shows that already Already, genetic processes such as pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, which allows for the removal of heritable negative traits, we're already using genetic manipulation to make sure that a child isn't born with an inheritable illness. These are parents seeking genetic counseling for their potential offspring and asking to preemptively select, not just for preventing things like mental retardation and blindness, but for even increased height and increased intelligence. And here's another interesting article. I find this pretty fascinating. The article is titled, "Egg Donor Adds Target Women of Ivy League." And the article states, quote, "The relevance of SAT scores does not end with college admissions. A healthy, attractive, Yale-educated female who has proven her academic achievement with an SAT score of 1500 or above can earn a cool $25,000 USD, provided that she's also a non-smoker. All she has to do to collect the money, according to a recent classified ad in the Yale Daily News, is donate her eggs to a loving couple." And then it says this about an egg donor brokerage agency named Tiny Treasures. This is very interesting. It says, "In a process akin to that of college admissions, Tiny Treasures requires all prospective donors to mail copies of their SAT scores and college transcripts with their applications, both of which have direct bearing on the amount of compensation received." And then it says, "The agency suggests first-time donors receive between $2,000 and $5,000, but students who qualify as, quote, extraordinary donors, that is, those with SAT scores above 1250, ACT scores above 28, and college grade point averages above 3.5, or those who have attended Ivy League universities, receive between $5,000 and $7,000 for their services." And this is what I mean by technology changing more than anything else the expression of fixed human nature. We know, as human beings, that certain heritable traits are passed on to our progeny. We know that to a degree, intelligence is heritable, and we might not know to exactly what degree it is, but we know that it is. And so technology has facilitated a means by which people of proven higher intelligence can sell their genetic material in a free market setting to people seeking to endow their progeny with increased intelligence and health and the success that comes along with it. You see, up until recently, mate selection was much more of a crapshoot than it is today. Mate selection consisted of assessing cues, external physical cues that indicate fertility or intelligence. For example, in women, you had ample breasts and waist-to-hip ratio, and in men, the intelligence to acquire resources for a woman's progeny, which indicated the ability to provide for her children. And in the case of women, this led to a situation where women employed all manner of concealment of what their actual genetic fitness was. Makeup and shoes, etc. This type of inefficient mate selection can be improved upon with a deeper understanding of the process of gene replication and the science of genetics. We are poised, as a species, on a chasm that once we leap off will allow us to delve much deeper into our understandings of what it means to be a viable and beneficial member of the human species and the value that his genetic contribution or her genetic contribution will make towards either strengthening or weakening the human species. Now, this, of course, does not in any way advocate for any kind of dysgenics or, sterilization or any other types of human rights violations. But positive eugenics is a good thing, it's a necessary thing, and it's a topic that should be explored in much more detail. And finally, this brings me to the topic of the stay-at-home wife. Now, I'm often asked, why, Barbarossa, do you have such a problem with the stay-at-home wife? Well, the truth is, I don't have a problem with them specifically. I mean, if they weren't so taxing on the development of our species, I really would have very little to say about them. And what I mean by that is simply that it's very possible that there exists a form of heritable and even latent IQ, the latter of which can only be developed by the creative exercise of the mind. I've talked before in previous videos about epigenetics, the genome above the genome, so to speak, and the possibility that this epigenome can affect this latent intelligence, and if so, can environmental factors that influence this epigenome result in lowered IQ if an individual, or a group of individuals even, are encouraged not to develop their intelligence? We know from studies of twins that smoking can certainly lead to differences in physical development with genetically identical twins. And these following images are of the facial development of both a non-smoking and smoking twin, and the differences are certainly there. Environment most certainly plays a part in the expression of genes. Here's an interesting article that says epigenetics and environment can lead to higher IQ and even impede the development in late age of Alzheimer's disease. And these are scientists who have been studying the genes of people whose brains at post-mortem showed these plaques